We can now start this webinar, and I'm going to hand over to Movena Benalik, and she's going to chair this webinar. Movena, the floor is yours.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Veronique. So I just want to start by thanking everybody again for coming along to our session today. I'd like to begin by giving you a bit of an introduction into who we are as a network. So we represent a network which is called PLAN. This stands for the Prisoner Learning Academic Network. So my name is Movena Benalik, and I'm the chair of the network. I'm also going to be chairing the session today. All of the panelists that are speaking today are members of the steering group. So the aim of our broader network is to support high quality research and high impact research into prison education. And we believe that in order to do this, we need to ensure that there are spaces for those who teach in prison, those who learn in prison, academics and research students to come together and share our perspectives and experiences. So we work to promote conversations between practitioners and researchers and believe that this should be at the heart of academic work. So we also believe that there should be conversations for academics to share their research with practitioners and those at the front line, something that we think can often be overlooked in the world of academia. The network plan was initially launched in 2018, and this was as part of the charity Prisoners Education Trust, which works across England and Wales. We're now seeking to broaden our reach by being positioned with the European Prison Education Association. But if you would like to stay in touch with us and the work of PLAN, please get in touch with me. My email address is going to be on the slides, which will be circulated after this webinar. So just to give you an introduction of what we're going to do today. So each of us panelists, of which there are 4, are going to present our work, speaking for approximately 10 to 12 minutes. This will leave us around about 30 minutes afterwards for questions. But we do encourage you to raise your questions throughout the presentations using the question box, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. If you do have a question for a specific speaker, we would be grateful if you could pop their name at the beginning of your question. You are able to ask questions in English, in French, or in Spanish. So without any further ado, I'm very happy to introduce our first panelist today, who is Dr. Helen Nichols. Helen is a senior lecturer at the University of Lincoln and has recently published a monograph in understanding the educational experiences of imprisoned men, re-education. So Helen is going to be speaking today about the purpose of education in prison, and I shall hand over to Helen.
Thank you very much, Movena. Technical skills have been achieved, I think. Can everyone see my slides and hear my voice and see my face? Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. So yeah, so I'm Helen Nichols, and for the last 10 years I've been researching education in prison with a primary focus on trying to generate a better understanding of how men, adult men in particular, in prison interpret and make use of their educational experiences. And in today's session, briefly, because I want to keep to time, I'm going to be talking about beyond employability, what is education in prison for? And hopefully this acts also as a preface to the remaining presentations, just to kind of kickstart the conversation about broadening our thinking of how education in prison is being used, and naturally how it has much more meaning than just developing skills for employment. And I'm just going to move to the next slide. Here we go. So while I am talking in this session about just some examples of the ways in which we can think about education in prison beyond the remit of employability, it is at the same time important to acknowledge that employability and enhancing employability skills is important in itself. So I'm not discrediting, the importance of people enhancing their employability skills through undertaking education in prison. What I'm trying to say in this presentation is yes, that is important, but actually there is much more to this process and much more to this experience. So in the context of England and Wales, the vast majority of people serving prison sentences will be released back into society. And on average, prison sentence lengths are 19.6 months, but we do see a lot of use of very short-term sentences of less than 12 months. So it isn't the case that we have people serving significantly long sentences en masse. People are coming out of those prisons, and that's why, of course, there is this focus on employability, because the focus is then about reducing rates of reoffending, of which are still currently very high. So employment and enhancing employability really is one of the core focal points of offender learning policy in England and Wales. And this in part is due to reducing reoffending, but also acknowledging the cost of reoffending, which is around £15 billion per year, and also in the knowledge that ex-offenders in employment are up to 9 percentage points less likely to commit crime. But as I've been saying, it's really important that we acknowledge the other things that come into play, the other benefits of engaging in education beyond those that are directly grounded in that employability focus. So today I'm going to talk to you very briefly just about ways in which we can think beyond employability in terms of what education actually can do for people in prison. And again, this is in the context of my research, which has been focused on adult male people in prison. So I'm going to talk about rethinking identity, coping, and relationships. And I'm going to try as far as possible to introduce prisoner voice to frame this discussion. So one of the things that I think is actually quite interesting and important when we're looking at prisoner identity is the international comparison when we look at countries, for example, like Norway, where prisoners are viewed as citizens with a right to education, which is very different in comparison to England and Wales, where people in prison are viewed as offenders whose risk of reoffending is the primary concern. So that is the core focus. But in relation to education, Costello and Warner have argued that seeing a person in prison as a criminal or offender has an impact on the way in which education in prison is focused, in that potentially it becomes too concerned with addressing behaviour. And as a result of that, this can negate learning that facilitates other personal developments in this broader, more holistic, potentially more liberal and humanistic sense. And as a result, we end up with potentially these kind of narrow vocationalist curriculum designs that are maybe missing opportunities to engage people in a much fuller sense. And thinking about this and drawing on the kinds of things that we know from our collective research as a panel, education can give some prisoners an opportunity to really reforge their identities, resulting in a change in their self-perception. And as a person who has delivered higher education in a high security prison, it's been fascinating to see the way in which some of the men who have engaged with that programme have commented that even if only for the purpose of being in the classroom at that moment, they have been able in those moments to consider themselves as a student rather than just being a prisoner. And this is important for self-perception, for building confidence, and of course for reimagining a future self in line with desistance narratives. And I've got a quote here from a letter that was written to the Prisoners Education Trust. And this was written by Jason. The name is not the real name, of course, it's protected identity. And in this letter, Jason is talking about the fact that he acknowledged that, yes, he has been in prison, but also he wants to reflect on the fact that he has taken a number of opportunities to engage in purposeful activity, to rethink who he might be in the future. And he says at the end of this quote that he wants having been in prison to only be a very minor part of who he is, not the be all and end all. So not having the prisoner identity overtake his identity in the future, that it's a part of his past that he acknowledges, he accepts, but it isn't the entirety of who he is and his character. Now, another thing that we can think about as well is coping. And we know that coping with a prison sentence can be distinctly challenging for a lot of different reasons, particularly given the mental health and physical health implications that being in prison can have, in amongst lots of other implications of living and operating under a disciplinary regime. And we know from well-founded research that not all people are able to cope with prison life, and to the kind of extreme. In some cases, this can lead to very poor mental health and suicidal behaviour at the most extreme end of that scale. And what's interesting to identify is the relationship between the way that prisoners serve their time and the risk that they may experience poorer mental health, or indeed, in the worst case scenarios, suicidal thoughts, tendencies and behaviours. And so what we can identify then is that people who are bored and spend their time in prison doing nothing were those who were in the category of suicidal behaviour. So those who were presented with suicidal behaviours have been much more likely to have spent their time in prison not being occupied with some kind of purposeful activity. And in that sense, then, education becomes something else. It can be about a coping strategy that helps prisoners to pass their time well. And we see this in lots of different ways, through reading, through engaging with academic courses. We also see it through engagement with creative activities, such as using artwork. And in these examples, in these quotes, and you can look at the slides later on because they are available on the website, so you can read these quotes in full. We can see people here using drawing, for example, as a way in which to make their mental health illnesses more manageable. It gives them something purposeful and active to do. Also, as well, in the right hand quote, which at the moment for me is blocked by the video screens, but I can remember what was being said, and again you can look at the slides afterwards. We have Alistair here talking about the way in which painting not only has brought some pleasure to what he describes as a very grim and dark environment, but also the way in which he's been able to use his paintings as a way to transform the immediate environment around him. So by having paintings on his cell walls, it creates much more of a manageable atmosphere to be in. And interestingly, what we see in England and Wales a lot, particularly in the tabloid press, these kinds of leading comments and assumptions that somehow prison in some cases is too easy. And we sometimes see men in prison talking about this. And interestingly, when I interviewed Azim, he said that people in prison say that it's easy because they've got to put on a front. So they have to present this identity that shows that they're coping with this. But he said that some of them will actually be in tears when they're alone. And in my own experience, when interviewing men in prison, the bravado that they display when they come into the interview space, for those who do, very quickly changes, and often that their presentation of self is very different by the end of the interview, when they realise that there isn't an audience there to perform to who has an impact on their day-to-day prison life. So relationships as well. So in my forthcoming book, which is being published in early March, one of the things that I talk about is the way in which education creates opportunities for meaningful relationships with other people in the prison space. And in this sense, I'm talking about their relationships with teachers. And this is because I was able to find that teachers, in some cases, felt more comfortable in adopting a more openly caring approach because they were there as civilians. They weren't wearing the black and white uniform that prisoners associate with officers and other disciplinary staff. At the same time as well, officers see prisoners on the wings, whereby we see these kind of cultural hegemonic masculine traits being performed in these spaces for various reasons. And Morwenna's going to talk some more about actually the cultural elements of prison life in her presentation. But teachers very often see a different person because those identities can be replaced in the education setting. Again, because prisoners are in the presence of civilians rather than officers and other disciplinary staff. And also they're with a different group of men who all have this shared interest in engaged learning. And Sophie, a teacher who I interviewed, commented on the way that education actually created just a bit of normality for the men. It was a normal experience that took them away temporarily from the other challenging experiences associated with prison life. In addition to that, we can think about education as having value in relation to the relationships between people inside and outside of prison. And Gregory commented about how he saw education as a gift. And this was because he was studying in prison at the same time that his son was studying for a marketing degree at university. And this gave them a shared point of discussion. It gave them a shared experience, and it almost figuratively broke down the boundaries that the prison walls placed between them. So in this sense, Gregory saw education and his engagement with education as a way in which it brought his family together by having that common activity and that shared line of discussion for phone conversations and letters that took him away from having to talk about the day-to-day prison life. So my closing thoughts for my brief presentation, and hopefully I'm somewhere in the 10-minute margin because I want to make sure I'm not running over time, is that the themes presented here around identity and coping and relationships, these themes are of course important to employability, and they all contribute of course to developing employability skills, and I'm conscious of that, and I think that is important to know. But I think they're also important in their own right. And in this sense, then, what I'm suggesting is that education in prison can have considerable benefits in the immediate prison context. It can have the benefits of, as prison staff have commented to me, in terms of keeping prisons safe places by having men occupied with purposeful, engaging activity. So in my research and as I write in my book, some of the ways in which I think education in prison can have these considerable benefits is the reduced pressure on adult male prisoners in these educational spaces to adopt and display hegemonic masculine traits. So the education department or classroom becomes a safe place to adopt a different identity. It can help prisoners to cope through mental escape, and it can allow prisoners to create their identity or recreate their identity to be able to seeing themselves as prisoner or offender, which is crucial to the journey of desistance. And finally, it can enhance relationships and encourage the building of future positive relationships with family and friends, which, as I've said, all of these things are positive to employability. They're positive connections to employability skills, but they're also important in coping with and managing prison life. And I'm going to stop there. I hope I'm on time.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Helen. Ever so slight, a minute or two over, but that was an excellent introduction to the myriad of different ways in which prison education can be valuable in people's lives. So an excellent start to our panel. Thank you so much. Right, now, I'm going to have to try and do these technical things, which I am less talented at than Helen. Okay, I just want to check if everybody can see my slides properly.
That's fine, Movina.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so my name is Dr. Morwenna Benalik, and I am a lecturer at the University of Westminster. And moving on from Helen's presentation, I want to be speaking to you today about one particular initiative that sought to do something a bit different in education, particularly further or higher education, so post-secondary education in a single prison in England. It's called the Open Academy. So to give you a little bit of a snapshot, the way that further and higher education operates in prisons in England and Wales, the funding for this is largely allocated through routes that are outside of the traditional way that funding operates. So further education, i.e. college level, is primarily provided through paper-based, so packs of distance learning, and these will be funded largely through the charity Prisoners Education Trust. And then higher education at university level is primarily provided through, again, paper-based, but also some partial digitisation, and largely produced through the Open University. So both further and higher education in prisons often is separated from the bread and butter, the traditional offer of prison education. So it's separated from the education department, and it's often a lone endeavour for those who choose to embark on it. So I want to introduce you to a project that sought to address some of the issues with studying by yourself in prison. And the prison that this took place in is a prison called HMP Swaleside. This was a medium security prison, which was very large. It had 12,000 prisoners within it. Now, this was a long stay prison. So the majority of men, it was all men within it, are serving 4 years or more, with a high proportion of these prisoners serving life sentences. Now, this is an institution that has had a number of challenges that have faced it throughout its years of operation. And these have kind of continued and have been enduring over many, many years. So this was quite a challenging site to try and do something innovative in order to support further and higher education. But what they did was create something which was called the Open Academy. Now, this was a space that was operating on a wing, which is separated from the education department. And it was filled with post-secondary learning resources, those at college level and those at university level. So on this wing, they created a library and a study room and also a computer room. Now, one thing that was really interesting about this initiative is that it was managed in the day-to-day way by prisoners. So prisoners were really in charge of what was happening and who was in this space and what studying was taking place. The people who chose to come to this initiative were paid for their time, which is different to how further and higher education operates traditionally. And finally, what's quite important is that the students that came to the Open Academy, some of them were formal distance learners who were enrolled on a course, and some were what was called self-study students. So these were students who were not formally enrolled, but were interested in perhaps becoming enrolled in the future, or were just interested in being engaged in conversations and debate around further and higher level topics. So just to give you a brief look, this is what the Open Academy looks like. I think it's quite important that this looks really different to how the rest of the prison does. It's quite bright, it's clean, there's these logos of organisations that were really invested in this project. And you can also see on the side here a really wide range of different resources available for students to come and use. Also, the seating was comfortable. The tables were created to try and promote group work and conversation and debate. And in the corner there, you can see the computer setup, which was where the prisoner manager, who was a prisoner, would sit and do the administrative work of the Open Academy. So the prison intended this initiative to operate in a few different ways, different phases. So firstly, they sought to create an accessible resource that was able to meet the needs of these existing distance learners, but also to engage potential future learners. But then once this was in function, they also wanted to develop a community of learners within the academy where they're able to support one another. And then they sought for that community to broaden out onto the wider wing and to develop a positive culture of learning across the rest of the wing. And I would like to reiterate that this was a prison where the culture was quite challenging and there was a lot of violence, particularly operating on this wing at the time that this was happening. So this was very innovative. To be clear, the students that were involved in the Open Academy, they were approximately 50-50 split, that half of these were formal distance learning students and the other half were informal self-study students who were interested in coming and accessing these resources without being formally enrolled on the project. As Helen's already noted, these slides are already available on the website, so you can have a little look in detail at a later date. So I wanted to take you through a bit of a journey of the Open Academy, and beginning with where it was operating at its best and what it did in order to create an oasis for the students that were within it, and also to support what I'm calling studenthood, by which I mean kind of different elements of student identity. Unfortunately, I'm then going to talk about what happened when the Open Academy unfortunately closed and the implications for that. So to begin with, what was really significant for the students of the Academy was the space that it operated and that it created. Now, a large amount of this was done through resources. So the fact that there were so many different post-secondary resources there was very, very different to what not only is available in that prison, but also across the wider estate of England and Wales. So there was a variety and a level of resources that was really hard to access elsewhere. And also, as I've mentioned, the environment was one which was clean, which was newly painted, and students experienced this as representing a level of respect not experienced elsewhere. Now, it was significant for those within the Academy that this was set within the madness or the chaos of the wing. So the wing and the prison had a reputation for violence, which was both threatened and experienced for students of the Academy. So being able within this one wing to be able to move from that into a different space, which was one that was experienced as being calm and relaxed and comfortable, allowed this education space to be one of an oasis, which was what a number of different students reported experiencing it as. Now, this created a space which allowed students to rehearse and support their own studenthood identities. Now, a significant feature of this was the ability to be able to exercise and rehearse autonomy. Now, this was something that was not only distinct from their experience of the prison at large, but also was separate from how they'd experienced education within that prison and in other prisons around the estate. So what students really benefited from and appreciated in this space was that they were able to be on your own time and study on your own terms. You can do it for 10 hours, you can do it for 3, you can stop, you can start. It's your own space, said Dan. As Zachariah stated, when I came here, they said you can just do it, and the way that you do it on your own terms, and you can teach yourself. That's what I liked best about it. So the autonomy that people were able to exercise in this space was very significant. Now, this was largely framed by the role of the peer mentors and the prisoner management of the space. And I also wanted to point out that there was, it was not only those students that were enrolled on a formal course that were able to exercise these student identities. Now, I very briefly want to talk you through the case study of Christopher, who came to prison with no qualifications. Elsewhere in the prison estate, he began a end of secondary level, GCSE level course, which was interrupted when he was transferred into a different prison. Now, in his past school experience, he was repeatedly excluded from school. But when he entered the prison, he received funding to embark on a post-secondary course as part of the Open Academy. Now, Christopher would come to the Open Academy on a daily basis. He would be very visible, and he would bring the course with him, the paper-based course. However, he never opened the course, as he said, I might give it back. There's no point wasting the resources. Now, he would come into the Open Academy and would often take a different book off the shelf and would start studying a different topic. But through this, he began to develop his confidence, and the peer support here was incredibly important in building up Christopher's studenthood identity. Now, Christopher became a peer mentor in the education department. He did not, however, end up opening the course and did not become a formal student. But education by this stage had become an incredibly important part of his identity. So beyond these individual benefits, there also was the development of a learning community. And this was framed around camaraderie, students coming together. And through this, they were able to find inspiration from each other's journeys and each other's histories, but also from each other's disciplines. So people were able to learn from others who were not studying the same courses as them, and it opened up people's minds. They were also very involved in setting the boundaries of this learning community and being in charge of who was able to have access and who was excluded from this learning community. This was very significant in some of the benefits when the Open Academy was operating at its best. However, as I unfortunately mentioned, the Open Academy was an initiative which started out and created these communities, but then it began to close and ultimately became the Closed Academy. Now, the factors that led to the closure of this innovation was that over time, students were restricted access to the space and to these resources. Now, because of this, the initiative began to lose legitimacy, not just for the students that were going there, but also for the wing-based staff who were very significant in granting or denying access to the Open Academy on a day-by-day basis. So the varying levels of staff support was very significant in allowing this initiative to slowly erode and eventually close. That was unfortunately supported by the institution that would move very slowly and was characterized by this sense of inertia, which meant that it was very challenging for this innovation to push back against that. And ultimately, the academy was closed. The implications of this, of course, led to students being frustrated. Now, they had come to this wing in order to be a part of this initiative, and unfortunately that meant that they were not being allowed out of their cell on the days that they were supposed to be using the academy. It meant that it was repeated for them that they were not a priority. And ultimately, the closure of the academy allowed students to feel that the institution did not care about their education or about where they went next. And this was unfortunately an experience that was shared by a large proportion of the students that I had interviewed. So I'm going to very briefly close with a few lessons that I think we can learn from the Open Academy. Firstly, that further and higher education can be incredibly powerful tools for shaping both individual and cultural experiences of the prison. It's also important for us to recognise that studenthood or student identity in prison brings with it its own rewards, and that these are not necessarily framed by qualifications, but that process in themselves can be very important. It is also important, where possible, to engage with external bodies that can help support the progress, particularly in an institution that might be pushing this back. And finally, it's important that we are cautious with the perils of innovation, and that hope can lead to broken promises. So it's significant, if we're seeking to be innovative in our practice, that we ensure that we are able to embed that from the very beginning and we can see it to its end. Okay, so that ends my presentation. I'm not entirely sure how I stop sharing. There we go, I can do that here. And okay, excellent, wonderful, thank you. So I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Kerstin Schiffris, who is a research associate at the University of Manchester. So Kerstin also has an upcoming monograph, which is called Philosophy Behind Bars, Growth and Development in Prison. So today, Kerstin is going to be talking about philosophy education in prison, and I shall hand over the floor to you.
Thank you, Morwenna. Hello, everybody. I'm going to just share my screen. Okay, so as Morwenna said, I have a monograph coming up, and I'm going to focus today on just a small aspect of the work that I've done in the prison environment, and more details of it can be found in the book that's on the right-hand side of your screen there. So, in the 1st century AD, Plutarch wrote of the ship of Theseus. The story goes that Theseus arrived in Athens on a wooden ship, which was preserved for generations. In order for the ship to be preserved, old rotten pieces were removed and replaced with new pieces. Eventually, this meant that all the pieces of the ship had been replaced. The question therefore became, is this really Theseus's ship? According to Plutarch, half the philosophers at the time believed this was Theseus' ship, and the other said it wasn't. Later, in the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes resurrected this problem, asking what would happen if a young sailor, not being able to afford his own ship, had kept the old pieces of Theseus' ship and built his own. So now there are 2 ships, and the question became, which ship is Theseus's? So the philosophical ponderings continue. Many others have asked similar questions. So why am I talking to you about mythological kings? Well, this is an example of a stimulus that I used as part of a philosophy class that I delivered in 2 high security prisons in England. So my work involved teaching philosophy in 2 prisons. It was part of a 5-year project, and I spent approximately 18 months in the prison. And the story of Theseus' ship is always the basis of my first session. It provides an interesting way of getting into philosophical questions, such as the ones that you can see here. What is identity? Is there a stable core self? Can our identity change? So, as I said, this was the basis of a 5-year piece of research. It was ethnographically led, which meant I spent time in the prisons. It involved interviews with participants, recording what happened in the classes via fieldwork notes. In each of the prisons, I delivered 2 12-week courses in philosophy. And the important thing is that the philosophy classes were based on a notion of dialogue, often referred to as a community of philosophical inquiry, where participants sit in a circle and are provided with a stimulus, such as the story of Theseus' ship, where they can explore concepts together and engage in cooperative conversation to build understanding. So, what did the participants say about their experiences of engaging in philosophy? Well, a range of themes emerged, but today I want to focus on relationships. A key part of the work was about developing tolerance and understanding between the participants. Here you can see some quotes from the people who engaged in the course. I had a different direction of articulating my opinions, so what I thought I knew I didn't quite know. Another says he's pragmatically learning more tolerance because another person really pushed his tolerance levels and he had to broaden his horizons. Fundamentally, what they found over the course of 12 weeks is that everybody had something to say and everybody was on equal terms. For them, the philosophy class provided a space where they could come together and engage in a conversation as human beings, as philosophers. And it might be that some of them had more education than others, some might be able to articulate themselves better, but everybody came to the table with equal value and equal contribution. And by listening to each other and having a space where you can engage in dialogue and conversation, participants found that they could engage in meaningful dialogue. They developed more nuanced perspectives. Over the course of the 12 weeks, I observed them growing in their abilities to articulate what they felt and what their opinions were on different matters. Instead of just being fixed, instead of just offering an opinion, they would listen to different perspectives and start understanding different ways of thinking about it. One in particular here talks about morality. He says that there are 3 levels. Some things are clear cut, you don't do this, you don't do that. Then other things are about your experiences. You learn from experiences that things are right and wrong. And then there are other things that come from interpretation. It's the way that you interpret things that help you figure out what's right and wrong. Another one here talks about how we don't have to be so extreme in our views. We can be more nuanced. We can understand the different ways of thinking about things. I think there's really, he says here, I think there is value in thinking about our past to make sense of who we are today, but it doesn't mean that we have to do it all the time. To understand the importance of these kinds of comments in this particular environment, it's important to understand what the prison environment was. One prison in particular that I worked in was Full Sutton. This is a prison in the north of England. It's a high security prison with the particular atmosphere at the time of working there, often described as politically charged. For those who are familiar with prison sociology, it really hit home with some of the discussions of things like low levels of trust, the hypermasculinity macho front that Helen's already alluded to. Many of them talked about boredom, solitude and time, psychological survival, and the whole prison, most importantly, was sort of characterized by issues of power and authority within the prisoner community, and obviously from between the prison staff and the prisoners themselves. And issues of trust flowed through the environment. There was also dominating faith narratives, which were particularly relevant to discussing philosophy in prisons. And there was also quite a lot of division and stigma, a sense of us and them going on in the prison environment. What we found, or what I found through spending time in the prisons and engaging in philosophical conversation, is that we were able in this space to develop trust and positive relationships. The philosophy classroom encouraged collaborative conversation as opposed to adversarial. It gave them time to develop a safe space where they were actually able to articulate their ideas without fear of everything they said being written down on a form or coming back at them later on when they're facing parole boards or things like that. It was a safe space where they could actually engage in conversation. We were able to establish trust. This didn't come naturally. This took a very long time and took quite a lot of perseverance, but we did manage to establish trust and relationships between participants. And over time, participants developed skills in communication and self-expression. They began to work together. As one non-philosophy participant said to me on a wing one day, they used to come back from philosophy separately, but they now come back together like they're a unit. You have done something here. So overall, participants clearly articulated the importance of having a safe space. They articulated how that was different in the wider prison environment, a place where power and authority and distrust flows, where they're not sure who to be friends with, where getting things wrong can come with high risk. But beyond that, as we can see here, Martin saying, I just think it gives people an opportunity to do something different because it's a getaway, and I think that's needed some time. And another said that it was freedom, a bit of freshness, a break from the banality and the drudgery of everything. Fundamentally, there are aspects of the philosophy course that are potentially true for any open educational opportunity. And when we think about what education can do and what role it can play in a prison environment, we perhaps need to recognise that it ought to play a similar role to that which it plays in wider society. It should allow opportunity for growth, self-reflection, and personal development. And anybody who knows much about prison environments, this is often not something that is possible. But what we found was that even despite a broader atmosphere working against this in the philosophy classroom, there were opportunities for growth within that. This relates specifically to cultivating trust between participants and cultivating positive pro-social relationships. For me, this was about meeting the people in my classroom as whole human beings, as philosophers, as opposed to offenders or prisoners or people serving a particular sentence. This is strengths-based. This is about building on what people know and giving them opportunity to explore things for themselves. They talked about used terms that indicated that they were becoming more psychologically nourished and giving them opportunities for meaning making. So that's just a small snapshot of some of the things that I discuss in my research and in the book that is coming out this summer. And I just want to finish by saying that this is one short course that happened at one particular moment in time, but by tracking what happened through extensive fieldwork notes, by spending time in the prisons, I was able to demonstrate that even in a difficult prison environment, it is possible to get positive outcomes. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that, Kirstine. Another really fascinating presentation about what's possible through the power of education. And I think a kind of common theme is about how it can contrast to what a lot of the rest of the prison seems to be doing to these people. So I'm going to introduce now our final presentation of the day, which is going to be delivered by Dr. Cormac Behan from the Technological University, Dublin. So Cormac has a really broad body of research associated with the experience and significance of education in prison, with a particular focus on citizenship. So Cormac today is going to be speaking about the role of education in the mosaic of citizenship. So I shall hand over to you, Cormac.
Thank you, Moana. So good afternoon, everybody. I think what's gone before me demonstrates the capacity and the potential that there is for the development of education in prison. And I suppose in many ways, when I look at education and indeed adult education, which I would put prison education within that framework, it's about inclusion. It's about enabling people to participate. And I think this draws on some of the themes that I have been looked at in the presentations today. And what I'd like to do is examine the role of prison education and what I term the mosaic of citizenship. Now, this draws on and expands T.H. Marshall's conceptualization of citizenship when he outlined three different elements: civil citizenship developed in the 18th century, the right to justice; political citizenship developed in the 19th century, the right to participate in the political process; and social citizenship developed in the 20th century, the right to live in society and share its benefits and its resources. And I argue to make up the mosaic, what has happened and what's become a byword of citizenship in the 20th century is the concept of active citizenship, that people should have the opportunity to participate as equals in society through volunteering, through contributing, and through making a positive impact on their community. So when we look at citizenship today, it's everywhere. It's all around us and discussed in the kind of hallowed halls of academia, but also amongst politicians, amongst community leaders, amongst journalists. We've got lived citizenship, substantive citizenship, formal citizenship, good citizenship, productive citizenship, and in particular, active citizenship. So what I want to do is examine and consider how this relates to prisoners as students and indeed teachers as educators in a penal environment. And the opportunities for prisoners to engage in the elements of citizenship, well, they vary widely across jurisdictions. But here are just some examples. Civil citizenship, the right to seek redress. That could be, for example, through the courts. Political citizenship, we know from our studies of the US and other jurisdictions where many prisoners are denied the right to vote. In other jurisdictions, for example, Norway, Republic of Ireland, prisoners have access to the franchise and are seen as part of the political community and the body politic. In terms of social citizenship, how can prisoners improve the context of their lives while they are locked up? That's maybe through prisoner councils, which are active in some jurisdictions, and in particular engagement, accountability and monitoring bodies. And then we look at active citizenship. Well, we're all aware of the various volunteering opportunities and citizenship or charitable activities that prisoners engage in many jurisdictions throughout the world, even where they're denied the other elements of citizenship. But let's look a little deeper and examine what is the potential for citizenship in prison. And therefore, we've got to look at the people and the places and the potential for citizenship, because citizenship is not a neutral activity that can be exercised or indeed understood outside of the context in which it takes place. And in this instance, it's the prison. We begin by looking at what Gresham Sykes called the deprivation of autonomy, one of what he called the pains of imprisonment, which seems to contradict the potential for citizenship, because it is absolutely essential that people have autonomy to participate. We know from our studies that throughout the world, prisons are full of people with low levels of traditional education attainment, many of them from marginalized communities outside, and that marginalization status is copper fastened inside. Many have personal issues and challenges. We also know that penal policy can be designed to further punish people after they've gone to prison. There can be an emotional tone in the debate around prisoners which see them as excluded from society, not only physically, but even psychologically. We also then see the potential for citizenship is impacted by the conditions of confinement. Also, what are prisoners' rights? What rights do they have? The institutional dynamics and the potential for positive prison officer and prisoner relationships, and then educational programs and opportunities that people actually have. So to start off, we got to look at what are the rights, the political, social, and civic rights that people have while they're inside. That creates a welcoming space for prisoners, or indeed a negative space, reminding prisoners of their status as excluded from society. If politicians engage in an emotional tone which seems to denigrate or undermine the potential to voice their concerns, that can also have an impact on the potential for citizenship in prison. Where is there communal space and place? And a number of my colleagues have talked about that, about how the school or the open learning centres can become places where a space is developed which is further down and deeper and separate from the institution itself. Is there dynamic security where there's a positive prison officer-prisoner relationship? How much time prisoners have out of their cell, and whether they can actually have the confidence to complain to accountability and complaints mechanism. Further, what is the prison life in terms of international standards for the conditions of confinement? Do prisoners see their imprisonment as legitimate? What do they have confidence that they are allowed a voice, that won't be seen as a negative? Are there potentials for engagement with the prison system through prisoner councils and solidarity amongst fellow prisoners? And then what I argue is, what are the opportunities for active citizenship within the prison? And essentially is encouraging people through the study of philosophy, through the study of the creative arts, through different elements which bring prisoners from where they are to build up the social and cultural capital, to give them the potential and the space to have a voice and to have something positive to contribute in society. And I suppose if we take education located in an adult education concept, there's potential, I think, for civic education and citizenship within prison, because my colleague, Dr. Anne Costello, who observed in her study of civic education in prison in her study in Ireland, talked about how civic engagement enables prisoners to reconceptualize their place in society, not just know their place, but reconceptualize it in the hope of creating a positive space for them. And that starts off, I think, first with, and Helen mentioned earlier, the language of how we treat prisoners. It begins in a way by education acting as a counterculture to the institution itself. Instead of viewing prisoners as confined individuals, but rather we view prisoners as students, as citizens, with the language of pedagogy, the present, the future, person, trust, equality, rather than the language of penalty. And I think that's very important when we are studying the potential for citizenship. So in conclusion, if we're to try and create the space for citizenship in a coercive environment, we have to begin to see prisoners as part of our community. We have to see the prison as part of wider society and understand how prison education can engage, enable, empower, essentially include. And therefore, if we see that education for citizenship becomes citizenship as education. And I think to do this, what we have to do is reframe the discussion around citizenship and imprisonment. Instead of examining prisoners and what they have done in breaking the social contract, we should examine how they can contribute to their community, participate in society, and enrich the social compact that binds us together as a community, allowing prisoners to contribute as a citizen both inside while they're incarcerated and outside on release. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Cormac. A really powerful presentation. I think forcing us all to reflect on our own work and what we can kind of take further in our own work. We have almost exactly 30 minutes, which is impressive. We have almost exactly 30 minutes for our Q&A session. So I would like to remind everybody that in order to post your questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. These will then kind of get forwarded to me in due course, and we can ask them to the broader panel. I'd also like to remind you that if your question is for a specific member of the panel, that we would encourage you to use their name in the question. So I have a few questions, in fact, to start, and they begin largely to you, Helen. And so we've got a few kind of technical questions asking about how does the prison system in England and Wales identify which prisoners go where. I think this is what we're talking about, particularly how you're seeing these as contrasting to Norway. So what factors determine how prisoners in our country get identified as to who goes where?
Okay, so is this in relation to who goes where in terms of who engages with education, or more kind of broadly speaking in terms of prisoners of different categories, just so I can direct the question in the right way?
Yeah, well, I think it would be interesting if you could reflect on who gets identified for education, perhaps.
Yes, no problem. So it may be as well that other speakers want to contribute to this as well, because there may be more to say than what I'm about to say. But primarily what I can speak to is where the focus lies. So the focus in England and Wales really is on basic skills. So in England and Wales, that's kind of level 1 and level 2 numeracy and English. And one of the things that is interesting about this is that those people in prison who maybe have a higher skill set educationally when they come into the prison environment aren't necessarily a priority for education. And this comes back to the employability focus, which actually in the high security prison that I did part of the research in was referred to as the employability farce. Because if you have a group of, this was actually one of the teachers in the workshop who called it the employability fast, because there wasn't sufficient differentiation for people who were doing longer sentences, for people who were already more educated. What do you do with these people? And clearly the teaching staff in that prison knew that education would have been really beneficial, and so they had to almost sneakily find ways to enable them to engage with education, and also as well go through kind of ad hoc processes of giving them educational support. So yeah, in terms of identifying which prisoners get access to education and what the priority is, it is the lower level basic skills which align to the wider national requirements for employment. So usually in England and Wales, a basic requirement now for a lot of employment is GCSE maths and English. So that's end of secondary school maths and English. And that's kind of the priority, the target when it comes to deciding who needs to go to education, more so than others. But if any other panelists do want to add to that in terms of beyond where the priority is, then please do step in.
No, well, I think actually it speaks quite a lot to some of the things that I was talking about in my presentation about the, working in a prison where there's a number of life sentenced prisoners. Lots of prisoners are there for 4 years, or every prisoner is there for 4 years or more. And when you have an education system that is so tailored towards, as you so rightly say, the end, and when that end is not even close to being in sight, the benefit of education gets distorted somewhat. I completely agree with you.
That's it, and it's kind of interesting because it links to what Kirstine was saying about the importance of strengths-based approaches, and arguably the focus is on deficiency as opposed to strength, and therefore the focus is on the educational deficiencies that people have as opposed to the educational skills and how they can then be enhanced. In the way that I suppose at university our students come to us with lots of different skill levels, and our goal is to look at them as individuals and support them in enhancing their personal skills to get to those next levels. So we may have some students coming in with lower level ability, and we want to push them to the next step. We might have some students coming in with higher ability, and we want to push them to the next step. Whereas in the across the prison estate, it is much more focused on deficiency as opposed to looking at those with educational strengths and thinking, well, how can we support these people in pushing them further in their educational journeys?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Kirstine?
On that note, it's probably important to be clear that in England so the UK split up into different regions, but in England and Wales and in Scotland, and Cormac's based over in Ireland, and across a lot of Europe, education in prisons is often fundamentally linked to what are often referred to as offender behaviour outcomes, as opposed to being educationally linked. I know in Ireland there's a lot of scholars that talk about the importance of education being in prison being part of a wider adult education, and I think Cormac can speak a lot more about that, but this idea that it should be about adult education, but in prisons it's not about adult education, it's about offender deficits, and it's about so this idea of employability is basically linked to the notion that increased employability will reduce likelihoods of recidivism, and so we should just focus on stuff that will help them in that. So it's not about the whole person, it's about specifically targeted, and it's linked to I think a lot of the hosts of this are based in Canada, I think, and this fundamentally is linked to the risk needs responsivity model developed by Andrews and Bonter some time ago, but that's just for those who know that model.
Yeah, completely. Cormac?
I suppose just to follow up from that, I think the thing is that education, like all other in prison, like all other approaches to education, is ideologically driven. And if the objective is to educate the whole person as opposed to train somebody, and training is a very, very important element. Helen mentioned that at the start of hers, that we would never undermine or negate the importance of training for prisoners or for any of us in our pedagogy and in what we do. But what we have to try and do is encourage people, number one, where they're at, but also believe that prisoners have the same right to education as anybody else has on the outside, and speak to that in a way that is about enriching people's lives. It's not just about training them for a particular job skill, which, as I said, is very important, but it's about getting them the opportunity to, you know, live a flourishing life like the rest of us can, who engage in these type of debates, engage in this type of life that we are as part as working in universities. And I think we have to start off with the basic that prisoners have the same right to education in its widest sense, and the opportunities for a holistic approach that people on the outside have. And I think here in the Republic of Ireland, it does speak to that, in that historically it was grew out of an adult education approach. And the one thing that I'm always reminded of in adult education is that adult education is about enablement and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's quite interesting, and thank you to Kirstine for making that really clear, that of course, despite coming and all of our research coming from the UK, we're actually coming from different education in prison environments, being split across England and Wales, and what's happening in Ireland, that they can be very separate. I've got some more questions here, a couple of clarifications, or a couple related to the Open Academy. One question that asks, how did the prison management allow the students to have the freedom to choose their times? And did they not have to follow the rules and time management set for other prisoners in the prison? To be clear, so the allocation to the Open Academy was framed around the traditional prison day, but they would be within that time, they would be able to do what they wanted within that space. So it was not about having to complete a particular activity by a particular point. And also the intention at the beginning in the prison initiative was that prisoners would be able to access the academy on times where they had free association, and not just when they were scheduled to go to work or to education. With the intention of it being experienced more like a library. But even though that wasn't possible and that didn't happen, the fact that students were permitted in that time to frame their own studies and frame how they used that time, the kind of 2.5 or 3 hour block, was experienced as being able to do and make your own choices in a way that was really separate from what they experienced in other education spaces in the prison. I have another question. I apologise, I don't want to dominate everybody, but another question just about some of the drivers that restricted the access to the resources and the academy. And the broader research that I did with this project took quite a cultural approach, with the intention of seeking to understand how this initiative fit within the broader prison. And this was quite valuable in helping to make sense of how the restrictions came to be. So this was operating at a time when there was reduced staff in general. There was some tensions between the operational staff and the education department. There were also tensions between different departments in the institution. And this led to a lot more prisoners being banged up, not being let out for various different reasons. But these began to build up progressively over time. And because this was operating on a wing, and it was dependent on staff who were not educationalists at their heart, it slowly eroded the access that prisoners were able to have. It was easier to keep people not in this space than it was to have them in the space. But that's quite a really small summary of a much broader project that was kind of happening. And also to be really clear that there were security issues that did play a part in the final closure of the Open Academy. So the fact that prisoners had a really important role in managing that space was not only really significant for its success, but unfortunately it was also significant in its downfall. And I think one important learning for me from this is that getting that balance can be incredibly challenging. I do not think we should stop, and particularly on reflection from Cormac's presentation, the significance of promoting autonomy and giving decision-making opportunities and giving leadership opportunities is very important. And if that goes wrong once, well, we're going to have to find another way to try again, I think. So I apologise, these were quite Open Academy specific questions, but if anybody did want to reflect on those as well, you are very welcome.
One of the things you mentioned about choice, I think, is really important, and certainly when I was delivering a program in a high security prison, I had a conversation with one of my students who was at the same time engaged with an offender behaviour management program, specifically around terror offences, and we had a discussion about what he was getting from the learning that we were doing, which was a traditional university module just in a prison. And he said, I kind of feel like what I'm getting from this is what they want me to get from that. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, why is it different? And he said, because I chose to do this. He said, I'm finding myself thinking in different ways because I'm having conversations with people who I wouldn't ordinarily have met. And I'm having to listen to other people's views and learn how to, as Kirstine talked about in her presentation, learn how to understand and interpret and give space to other people's views. So skills like listening and tolerance and communication were all coming through, but it was indirect. And that indirect nature, in terms of higher education, of all those things that can come out naturally, were all grounded in choice. And he said, because I've chosen to do this, it means more to me. And I'm still getting those same things that I know they want me to get from this behavior modification program. And it just felt a bit more organic. And I think that's quite interesting to see how education can actually do these things in a more organic and natural way in comparison to programs that are being done to people in that sense.
Can I come in on just that last point? I agree with Helen, and I'm going to say that Cormac's has stuff to say on this too. But I think one of the key points about education in prison is maintaining this focus on educational outcomes. That is when the power of it really seems to matter. So instead of saying, like, I'm going to provide this education for you because it's going to help you in your rehabilitation, it's I'm going to engage you in an educational course for the sake of engaging you in an educational course. And the pedagogy is about, and certainly in my philosophy class, I didn't have a set of conclusions or a way of thinking that I wanted them to get to. I had a set of sort of starters that would give them the opportunity to engage in philosophical thinking, which encourages a bunch of skills that we can go into another time. But the idea is that that's what they meant when they talked about freedom. It didn't mean literal freedom. It meant freedom of thought and freedom of expression, which is just not really possible in the wider prison, and is certainly not possible in offender behaviour programs as a rule.
Yeah, absolutely. Cormac, did you want to respond to that as well?
I suppose to reiterate those 2 points, I'd be brief. It's just again, it comes back to what's the ideological kind of basis behind the kind of education of prisoners. And I do think it is about saying that we enable them to make these decisions and choices, because it's not just about the accumulation of knowledge or the acquisition of skills. What you learn in a learning space is much broader. And as Kirstine is saying, like that tolerance, that, nuance, that gray area, that response to somebody who upsets you in the class, all of those things that we kind of create in a space, which is different to the kind of masculine place that a prison can be, I think may have the same outcome and surprising outcomes. And I suppose if I could just make one point, these ideas were put forward over 20 years ago, and there's a book by a man called Stephen Dogood called Can Prison Work? And it came from the Simon Fraser universities, where they set up the humanities program in the 1990s in Canada. Read that book. It's a wonderful contribution to challenge us all to what is education and can prison work.
I absolutely agree, and I feel like I need to also add to that unfortunately some of the amazing projects that he was involved in seem to go a similar way to the Open Academy in the end, where they unfortunately are no longer operating, but some incredible work that comes from that. The final thing I'd like to add to that as well is not only do we need to think about outcomes as educational outcomes, not behavioural outcomes or prison or employment outcomes, but I would also encourage us to look beyond qualifications as well. One thing that I think really came through with the work with the Open Academy was that so much of the kind of soft skills, as they're often passively called, but I think are so valuable, as you've all just mentioned, these skills of confidence, these skills of how to work with others, these skills of how to know how to be successful or know how to fail. All of these skills can be incredibly important in an educational space. I've got a question that I think is mostly for Cormac about the role of prison councils, and if you could perhaps describe what they are and how they operate.
Okay, I mean, these are institutions that operate in various prisons throughout Europe and indeed in other jurisdictions, where basically that on a wing or a particular landing, that people would be elected to convey the views of prisoners to the prison authorities in a way that's kind of productive, that gives them a chance to either stand as a leader or participate in voting. I think it's really important in a number of ways. Number one, I think it was it you, Moana, who mentioned, about leadership, about what happens with people who take on these roles. They don't just become a leader of prisoner council, but they become kind of role models for how people can negotiate within a place which is not known for negotiation anyway, because it's a very hierarchical institution. But it's encouraging people to see the context they're in. How can they achieve a better place for themselves and better community for their fellow prisoners? So in England and Wales, there's a group called User Voice, which promote the idea being that the prisoners would have a voice within the prison, and there's some research done around that, and in other countries throughout Europe. Some of them are more successful than others. Number one, depends on how much power they have. There are certain exclusions to what they're allowed to have a voice in. And secondly, it can depend on local management, whether local management are willing to use them really as an engaged process or just as a process to instruct the rest of the prison. This is the decisions that are made already.
Thank you very much. And we've had another question which has asked to repeat the title of the book, which is Can Prisons Work? The Prisoner as Object and Subject in Modern Corrections. And this is written by Stephen Duguid. I never know how to pronounce his name. Spelled D-U-G-U-I-D. I hope that is helpful. We've got a really wonderful question here, which has been translated through Google Translate. So I apologise, I'm going to have to work my way through it. But is it possible, and this is to all the panellists, I think, is it possible to configure moments of a liberating education with creative and playful spaces in the context of seclusion and prisons? That can be underlying as a device for transformation of the subject who's been deprived of liberty, and that can become a change socially and in the community. So I believe we can interpret this in lots of different ways, but I think that this is a question asking how possible is it to have these really valuable, creative, playful, I love that, playful spaces in a prison, and how valuable that can be in a broader understanding of how education can change a community. Kirstine, would you like to start on that one?
Yes, is the short answer. It is possible. It's very hard and it takes work, but what I eventually, in writing my book, I managed to articulate it in the final chapter a little bit beyond the book's based on PhD work. But what I realised I hadn't put into the PhD, which I have put into the book, which is that there were examples where there were moments of what I refer to as growth. I prefer the word growth to transformation. I think words like transformation and corrections and change puts an onus of making people get to a certain point, and I prefer the idea of growth, which is building on where people are in personal development, but I might change my mind on that at some point. But because there was like the creativity that happens in the philosophy classroom through, like, it was a very much you know, a place where the participants could take the conversation in any direction that they wanted, and through this sort of 12 weeks of sort of engaging in shared experiences and in shared conversation where we got to know each other, we learned to trust each other. There were some really clear moments of surprising insightfulness from the participants and also myself. I engaged as a co-philosopher with them. I wasn't sat outside, I was part of the circle. And there were clear moments where they were able to reflect on their lives, where they wanted to be in the future, who they wanted to be, how they wanted to live, that kind of thing. In terms of whether that can be carried out into the community, I mean, fundamentally, these guys were serving 30 years in prison. Whether a 12-week philosophy course is going to have lasting change is kind of potentially beyond what you can hope for with a course like that. And, you know, it's not possible, but there were moments that would suggest it's possible for this to be cultivated given the right circumstances, is what I would say.
Excellent, thank you very much. If anybody else would like to come back on that, we've got a very strict 4 minutes before we unfortunately have to draw this to a close. But Helen, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I'll say one thing really quickly, because I think you could also answer this question in terms of what are the key characteristics you need to create those kinds of spaces. And I think one of the key characteristics for me in my experience was trust, and this is something that Kirstine talked about in her presentation. And in my experience, it took quite a lot of time in some cases for the men who were engaged in my class to trust that I wasn't doing an experiment on them, that this was a real thing, and that there were no kind of strings attached, that this was learning for learning's sake. And that was something that was quite difficult for them to get used to. And in fact, some men have written to me since and said, I'm still convinced it was an experiment, despite the fact that I enjoyed it. And I think this is something we really have to understand and really take seriously, the importance of trust in creating those safe spaces in order that people feel that they can have broader conversations and they can get things wrong, get things right, they can support each other. So without going over time, I would just like to highlight trust as being something really important to creating those kinds of environments.
I'll be very brief. One of the first principle of education in prison in the Republic of Ireland is to help people cope with their sentence. And I think in its simplicity, that's quite powerful, because, you know, all of us appreciate a beautiful written book. Sitting there, it takes us to other places. And I think it giving the opportunity for prisoners, while they were in a very coercive, generally negative place with all sorts of chaos going on around them, to take them away from that, to give them an opportunity to recognize that they have a right to well-being and they have a right to flourish. And I think helping them cope with their sentence begins that. But like Helen is saying, trust, legitimacy, all other things would be significant as well.
Absolutely. Thank you to everybody for your contributions there. And also thank you to everybody for your wonderful comments that I will share with the panel afterwards, and also for your fantastic questions. I want to, before I hand back to Veronique for a very, very brief introduction of the next panel, I just want to close by saying that we are the Plan Network, and we would really like to stay in touch with you all. So our email address, my email address, or some of our email addresses are on these the slides that you'll find available on the website. So please do reach out if you'd like to stay in contact with the network. So do we have time, Veronique, for me to hand back to you?
Yeah, thank you very, very much. Just want to thank you all for your, oh, it seems I'm not. Okay, thank you very much for all 4 panelists for this great panel that I can see many people enjoyed as well as me. Just the last word to tell everybody that the next panel will be in French. It will be in 3 weeks from now. And it's proposed by Fanny Salan, who is teaching at the Université de Nanterre in Paris. And it will be a panel with the point of view of someone who is teaching, someone who is doing research, and someone who is an officer at correctional facilities. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you hopefully in 3 weeks from now. Thanks again for the panelists for the brilliant contribution.